Opening the king's diagonal offers immediate influence and potential for rapid development. Embracing the Sicilian defense, black immediately contests the center and initiates a dynamic, imbalanced struggle with this asymmetric pawn thrust. Securing a central pawn while preparing to unleash queenside pressure, this develops a knight towards the heart of the board. Establishing a pawn chain that can influence the center and prepare for a queenside expansion. Challenging the center immediately, this opens lines for your pieces and seeks to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure. Opening the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and tests pawn structure resilience. Initiating development with knight centralization, this thrust aims to control key squares and prepare for rapid piece activity. Challenging the knight's dominion, this develops a piece while preparing to contest the center. Securing the central knight, this repositioning allows for potential development into a more active square, influencing critical diagonals. Bringing another piece into the fray, black solidifies control over central squares and prepares for further development, potentially targeting white's d4 knight. Launching an assault on the f7 pawn's defensive structure, this bishop directly challenges black's setup while preparing for potential kingside aggression. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the queen's bishop, black opts for a classic setup, though this does concede a slight spatial advantage on the queen side, as white's pieces can now aim towards the king side. This choice often leads to strategic battles where pawn structure and piece activity become paramount. Establishing this bishop's presence on the king side offers white a robust pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside attacks, while subtly challenging black's central control and creating lines of sight towards f7. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling, this move tactfully reroutes the knight from its current pawn-guarded square, aiming for a more active diagonal to influence the center and potentially create attacking chances. Shielding the king behind a pawn wall, white prepares to castle queenside, aiming for dynamic, aggressive play and an attack on black's king. Creating a more robust kingside defense, this pawn advance prepares to push further and potentially gain queenside space. Securing the king on the queen side opens up the d-file for pressure and prepares potential pawn storms on the king side, a bold maneuver that initiates a dynamic struggle for central control and king safety in this Sicilian variation. Positioning the queen centrally allows it to influence the d7-g4 diagonal and potentially support a queenside pawn advance, while also preparing to castle queenside and join the fight along the open d-file. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal prepares for potential pawn breaks in the center and simultaneously eyes the king side, hinting at future aggressive maneuvers, while also offering a safer square than the active c4 outpost. Fortifying the bishop's position and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this retreat subtly aims to connect the rooks and offers a nuanced development that avoids immediate tactical skirmishes, instead favoring a solid positional stance. Aggressively carving out queenside space with g4 signals a bold, perhaps even reckless, attempt to stifle black's potential queenside expansion and create attacking chances. This pawn thrust immediately injects a sense of dynamic tension, potentially opening lines on the kingside for white's pieces should black respond defensively, but also potentially weakening white's own king shelter if black can exploit the newly created pawn weaknesses. The move prioritizes immediate kingside initiative over solidifying the center or developing pieces to more harmonious squares. Seeking to simplify the structure and potentially open lines for his queen's bishop, black exchanges knights on d4, altering the pawn complex and inviting a recalculation of the central dynamics. Reclaiming the bishop on d4 immediately addresses black's central pawn capture, re-establishing white's material parity and aiming to prevent black from solidifying their center further. This action also liberates the queen on e2 to potentially swing over to the king side or support an advance along the g-file, creating dynamic attacking chances. White's castling queenside now feels more secure, as this bishop can offer defensive support if needed, while simultaneously being poised to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's pawn structure. Shattering the center, Black injects immediate dynamism, seeking to exploit White's potentially overextended kingside pawn structure by opening lines and creating active piece play. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, White seeks to pry open lines towards Black's monarch, forcing a sharp confrontation rather than allowing a positional squeeze. This aggressive advance directly challenges Black's knight and aims to create immediate weaknesses in the pawn structure. Opening up the center with this pawn capture decisively alters the game's dynamic, transforming a blocked position into one ripe with tactical possibilities and potentially exposing the king's defenses. Unlocking a powerful open g-file for White's rook, this capture dismantles Black's pawn shield and instantly heightens the pressure on the kingside, creating exciting attacking prospects. Black captures the knight, accepting the pawn sacrifice to clear the queenside and aim for quicker development, although it opens up the king's defenses with a doubled pawn structure. Liberating the f-file, White boldly sacrifices the pawn on e7, aiming to shatter Black's kingside and expose their monarch to a swift assault, opening up the crucial dark squares for the bishop. Unleashing a surprise check, Black disrupts White's planned rook lift by forcing the king to a less secure square, simultaneously sacrificing a pawn to gain critical tempo and potentially break open lines for their remaining pieces. The king's desperate flight to b1, a preemptive measure against the storm brewing on the c-file, highlights Black's surprisingly effective pawn sacrifice for significant positional advantage, disrupting White's structure and opening lines toward the exposed monarch. The king's sudden central relocation, though forced by the recent skirmish and aiming to escape the immediate checks, exposes a significant vulnerability on the e7 square, opening up the possibility of further pressure from White's powerful bishop and knight duo. Chasing the Black king into the center with the queen, White sacrifices pawn structure for immediate attacking prospects, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch. Gaining a pawn is tempting, but this pawn push is actually a strategic concession, sacrificing kingside safety for a material advantage that might prove fleeting. Unleashing a surprise check, White attempts to exploit Black's exposed monarch, aiming to disrupt the coordination of Black's pieces and potentially force a king escape into an even more precarious position. Instantly, the king's central refuge is abandoned, embracing a precarious existence on the 7th rank. This pawn push, while seemingly aimed at disrupting White's queen and bishop battery, creates a significant weakness on the kingside. The dark squares around the Black monarch, once defended, now lie exposed to potential invasion, particularly the g6 square if the g-pawn advances further. Furthermore, the pawn on f6 weakens the crucial e6 square, which could become a target for White's pieces. This move signals a shift towards a more dynamic, albeit riskier, middle game where Black must actively defend their exposed king. Unleashing a pawn thrust, White aims to dismantle Black's pawn structure and create attacking pathways, daring the opponent to find a coherent defense amidst the mounting pressure. Accepting the pawn sacrifice, though it opens up the king, directly tackles White's aggressive pawn storm and aims to disrupt their attacking potential by centralizing the king. Unleashing the f-pawn now irrevocably opens the f-file, creating immediate pressure against Black's somewhat exposed monarch and simultaneously challenging the pawn structure around the enemy king. This aggressive pawn push gambles on rapid development and attacking opportunities, accepting a somewhat compromised pawn majority for the sake of activity and initiative. Black bravely pushes the pawn forward, aiming to disrupt White's attacking structure and potentially open lines toward the enemy king. This gambit, while risky, offers a chance to regain lost material and create an imbalance. The immediate consequence is a dramatic shift in the central pawn tension, forcing White to react decisively to the new tactical possibilities that have just sprung into existence. The queen repositions, targeting the f6 pawn while simultaneously preparing to potentially launch an attack on the king's weakened defenses, creating immediate tactical unrest. Shifting the rook to the open e-file immediately contests a key tactical avenue, aiming to disrupt White's initiative and potentially create counterplay for the beleaguered Black king. Initiating a decisive offensive thrust, this maneuver skillfully redirects the rook to a more active central position, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside pawn structure. Navigating the treacherous terrain around the Black King demands constant vigilance, repositioning the monarch to a less exposed square like d8, away from the immediate glare of White's bishop and queen, prioritizes defensive solidity over any potential attacking ambitions. Bringing the second rook into play, this maneuver actively seizes the open d-file, a crucial artery in the current battlefield, preparing to apply significant pressure against Black's vulnerable monarch and potentially creating mating threats by leveraging the weakened kingside. The king retreats, seeking refuge behind a pawn chain that now appears more fragile than protective, a subtle acknowledgement of White's pervasive central control and the looming threat on the d-file. The rook slides across the 7th rank, a bold declaration of intent, aiming to slice through Black's defenses and expose the beleaguered king. The queen's capture on d7, while seemingly forced, initiates a dramatic shift towards open lines and potentially a swift conclusion as White's rook now commands the d-file with authority, creating immediate pressure on Black's vulnerable king position. Seizing control of the now open d-file, White initiates a decisive maneuver by capturing Black's last remaining rook, fundamentally altering the material balance and ushering in a new phase of the game where Black's exposed king will become a significant liability. The king is now exposed on the d7 square, a prime target for White's remaining pieces, especially with the open d-file that could soon be exploited. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, the White queen orchestrates a brilliant tempo-gaining check, forcing the Black king into a precarious, exposed position on the 7th rank, directly impacting the crucial open file control and dramatically escalating the pressure on the weakened Black monarch. Black's king finds a temporary haven, a precarious respite from the relentless pressure on the dark squares, yet the exposed position and lack of immediate defensive resources on the queenside hint at continued struggles to consolidate. Seizing the opportunity, the queen marches forward, directly confronting the vulnerable Black king. Opening up that central pawn allows a dynamic piece insertion, aiming to disrupt White's established defensive structure and potentially unpin your remaining pieces. This forcing check offers Black a stark choice between a difficult king retreat or a desperate attempt to disrupt White's initiative.